My name's Ian Dickie. I'm a director of eftec, and I'm going to introduce you to our fantastic panel. We're going to hear from them for approximately 30 minutes or so, and we will then have a comfort break and time for further discussion, which will be driven by your questions, which have already been entered in Slido by some of the delegates as they've heard Alessandra talking. So please keep your questions coming in there. Our panel really reflects the breadth of work now taking place under the broad title of natural capital accounting. We'll firstly hear from Professor Giles Atkinson, Professor of Environmental Policy at London School of Economics, who was a member of the first Natural Capital Committee when the UK really started its work developing natural capital accounts. Then Robert Hall, who is an Associate Director of Federated Hermes, an investor, and he works on interdisciplinary environment and socioeconomic measurement and evaluation of systems to assess investments across public and private markets. He'll be followed by Carl Obst, a director of the Institute for Development of Environmental Economic Accounting, the IDEA Group in Australia, but he's been a key author of the CEA standard presented in the keynote by Alessandra Alfieri. Then work on another standard will be talked about by Ece Ozdemiroglu. She's the founding director of eftec and has been chairing the committee producing the British Standard Institutions standard on organizational natural capital accounting. Then we'll hear from two practitioners of national ecosystem accounting work, Alessandra Notte, who works at the European Commission's Joint Research Centre and working on applying methods for ecosystem accounting in Europe, and Rocky Harris, finally, from the natural capital accounts team in Defra, who similarly has been working on application of accounting in the UK. So thank you to all our panel for joining, and I'll hand over to Giles to kick us off with some of his thoughts about really what society is trying to measure with their approaches to natural capital accounting.
Thank you very much, Ian, for the introduction. I'm going to talk about natural capital accounting mostly at the national statistical process level, and talk a bit about policy uses and research agendas, given my my academic affiliation. I mean, I'll start by saying that it's absolutely incredible what has been achieved in a relatively short space of time, and I feel very privileged this morning to be sharing the screen in this session with a number of the people who have been really key and responsible for that progress. So, you know, just take the United Kingdom. It's, you know, nearly 10 years now since the Office for National Statistics roadmap, and it's striking there how much has been achieved. Now, all the more so as it wasn't obvious at the outset that that would be the outcome. So, you know, with a sort of a few years behind us now, I won't be giving away secrets to say there was some nervousness in Natural Capital Committee circles about the ambition and urgency of the roadmap back then. But it would be a really harsh critic that wouldn't be impressed by what has been achieved. I think we still have a question about what we're going to use natural capital accounting for. In the UK, this is a nice problem to have, as we actually have an impressive stock of work to draw on. But we do have some basic questions still to answer. So should we stick to our policy applications where accounts have comparative advantage? So maybe that means pushing on to link to the national accounts themselves. Or do we see national capital accounts as a self-standing evidence tool? In which case there's an additional challenge, which essentially is how to embed a new empirical framework within an already established evidence-based policy-making process. And then what do we want for that new empirical framework? You know, is it to prompt attention to a problem? Is it to generate knowledge on the effectiveness of policy solutions? Or is it both? I mean, these are really important basic questions that we need to think about. Let me talk about something else that's interested me recently, which is distributional issues. Ian, can we see the slide now? Is that? Oops. Okay, we're on the slide. Yes. Ian, can you nod if you can see? Okay, thank you. So, one aspect that we know concerns us about policy outcomes that natural capital accounting has been silent on largely so far is that natural capital policy is going to have distributional consequences. So clearly the pandemic has sharpened this focus. Access to natural capital based recreation, free at the point of entry. In principle, this should be a great equalizer, but evidently it hasn't been in many places. So this really suggests that we should be accounting for how ecosystem services are distributed amongst users of natural capital. And these ecosystem services, quite often, they are closely aligned with environmental justice concerns. I mean, there is a challenge here. This really does require detailed spatial information to be assured that ecosystem service inequalities that we might be able to describe, whether they really do constitute environmental justice concerns. And I suppose the sort of question to ask ourselves is, well, will practical natural capital accounts routinely have that sort of granularity that you will need to really try to tell environmental justice stories? But one element that I think that practical natural capital accounting can definitely help with on looking at distributional questions, which strikes me as equally as interesting, is the issue of land ownership and land on which natural capital essentially is located. So, for example, Eurostat have documented a process of increasing farmland concentration and land inequality in Europe. And the slide here essentially is a shameless plug for some work that I've done recently with Paola Avanda, which is related to this. So, essentially, what did we do? Well, we looked at land ownership in Scotland. We took what we knew from official practical natural capital accounts on the distribution of ecosystem services and where natural capital was located. We looked, which is on the left-hand side of the slide, at how what we knew about land ownership, public versus private, very small to very large landowners. Essentially, this is a story about private-owned land, very unequally distributed. We combine those two bits of information essentially to see, well, what do we learn by putting all those different sources of information together? So again, the issue here is that natural capital policy is going to have distributional consequences. If you place regulatory obligations on landowners to maintain enhanced natural capital, that'd be one set of outcomes. Payments for natural capital services will have distributional impacts as well, given that structure of land ownership. So essentially, all we're doing here is just pushing natural capital accounting a little bit further to link to concerns about wealth distribution. So very quick last point. I think that's important too, because not only trying to align to policy uses, but also to try to align to research issues as well. And I think finding research questions for natural capital accounting is really critical too. As a research agenda, we do risk it burning itself out quicker if it's only essentially about how to do natural capital accounting better. So we need to think about what research agendas we can link the work that everybody is doing to that. Personally, I'd make a pitch for distributional issues, but I'm sure there's many more topics. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Giles. And that's great to lay down that challenge to people working on accounting. And interesting to hear that public policy perspective. Now for a different perspective from Robert Hall, that of an investor in the finance sphere. Robert.
Thank you. Yeah, that was really, really interesting, actually. The person who goes before you always suddenly makes you want to readjust your own thoughts on what you were going to say. But so yeah, as Ian said, I was asked to give the perspective of business. But let me instead give you our particular interest, not as a single business, but as an institutional investor, investing the money of future retirees into a variety of globally disaggregated companies across all sectors and all geographies. So a bit of background, we are a global sustainable institutional investor, a founding member of the United Nations Principles for Responsible Investment. So our interest, we are currently developing a framework that would enable us to invest in those stocks of natural capital, flows of ecosystem services, and various measures for the enhancement of biodiversity, for which a cash tradable, in-kind or notional marketplace exists, or where the capacity to directly or indirectly value or account for the double material relationship of nature, corporates, countries, buildings, infrastructure, whatever it might be, to at least a single tier exists. So a lot of complexity there, which I'll unpack in a second, but generally this will include nature-based solutions in the context of both hyperlocal biophilic design, sustainable drainage systems, etc., onto wider regional and global opportunities to combine the delivery of carbon sequestration with natural flood resilience schemes, environmental gain maximization, just a net gain, other forms of natural capital increase, and the preservation of ecosystem services. We're attempting modestly to develop a system of ecosystem services valuation and optioneering, with the intent to align it with the various natural capital accounting frameworks which have been released or in the process of being released or being shaped. Really exciting time, a bit of a tipping point. And all of this work will be predicated on the methodological assumption, relies on the methodological assumption that a complete value chain can be described, leading from primary productivity through to human, corporate and economic activity. This probably suggests we're slightly heterodox vis-a-vis other large financial sector institutions in our approach, and we often are more frequently working directly with academics and a variety of other scientific and empirical econometric research institutions, rather than investment industry intermediaries to develop novel and best currently possible empirical systems to measure the impact of infrastructure, buildings, governments, companies on natural capital and biodiversity. A shameless plug, but please do get in touch if you want to discuss that further. I think regarding our own investment framework, in order to establish everything I've just described, in the last instance, this requires us to be able to identify how to realise in cash terms, directly or indirectly, so it can be a real return or a kind of a de-risk opportunity cost mitigation measure, a way to realise that in cash terms, the maintenance and increase in biodiversity, natural capital, ecosystem services, etc. So very challenging, to say the least, outside of carbon and biodiversity. And we see our own work in this space as an input into standards that have been established, government and related agency considerations of just how to establish I think in effect would be a UK market and eventually a kind of a global market for non-carbon ecosystem services. Giles has just mentioned, actually, very importantly, that there is a risk to be monitored, that this should not interpolate existing distributional inequities in a way that it has a profound, I think, potential to do so, given how just how extreme that inequity is. But I just wanted to flag something which I think sometimes gets lost in the conversation and perhaps seems ironic, given that we're a very quantitatively oriented organisation. But in the first instance, if that's in the final instance, what we need to be able to do to realise in cash terms a way to actually trade on this value. In the first instance, that does mean that we need to find a way to surface the interaction across time of the anthropogenic and the naturogenic domains. So put simply, again, as I said above, we need to be able to find a way to describe the full value chain that exists between primary productivity and all human economic behaviour. So in a similar way, I think, to some of the work we do on social valuation, natural capital accounts facilitate the process of valuation, but they only sort of outline, adumbrate, delineate, describe partially the latter. That is what actually it is that establishes these interlinkages and these interreliances systemically. And this always has again, I mentioned social impact, it has the effect of introducing a bit of an irony in that we're in the process of sort of requiring a quantification of essentially what will always remain partially irrational or metaphysical, especially when we're talking about nature, and especially when we're talking, for instance, about maybe the broader health and well-being impacts, which Giles, I think, just flagged as well, and which are an input into aggregate productivity, even on a kind of economic basis. So I don't know, how does one in some way incorporate this accursed share, paraphrasing George Bataille horribly, but I mean, it's not really a waste, it's the inverse, this kind of inexpressible surplus value delivered by the natural environment. And I don't know if that's through a discount rate, heterodox discount rate, some kind of notional markup. I don't know. I don't know what the answer is there, but they're the sort of questions that we're beginning to probe, and they're the sort of questions I think need to be answered before the question that Giles asked about exactly the kind of utility and the practical application of these accounting standards will really be, I think, realised.
Great, thank you very much, Robert. And yeah, laying out some of the challenges there really, but also highlighting how better measurement, linking together data brings new opportunities. And I think that's a feature of natural capital accounting overall. And I'll ask Carl to talk a bit more about how linking up data within the CEA can help us with make progress on better measurement and the opportunities around that. Carl.
Great, thanks very much, Ian, and thanks to the conference for the invitation to be able to talk to you. I was going to say tonight because it's tonight for me. I'm in Victoria in Australia, and hopefully, hopefully we can contribute something into this discussion. As Ian introduced before, I've been sort of playing a key role over the last 10 years in developing the system of environmental economic accounting, and particularly on the ecosystem accounting side of things, which was just released as a standard in the last 10 days or so. This issue around the opportunities that might be created from the CEA, that's the focus of what I wanted to make my comments on, was what the CEA could provide in terms of the opportunities around measurement. One of the ways this might be thought of is what would it mean to make progress in terms of measurement? So just as an opening sort of thought, I think the key challenge here is not that we are not undertaking a lot of measurement. There's a lot of people who are undertaking data measurement, development of frameworks of all sorts of things, and that's been an ongoing process in the environment and sustainability space for the last 40 or 50 years. So I think the question of making progress is really one about scaling up or mainstreaming. So for me, the question is, to what extent can the CEA contribute to that process of mainstreaming? And I guess three thoughts have come to me in that respect. One is certainly around data. And I think what CEA does provide in that space is a focal point for data around a set of definitions, a set of classifications, a degree of a framework for coherence across information on ecosystem extent, ecosystem condition, ecosystem capacity, ecosystem services, ecosystem valuation, so that you're not looking at each of those things in isolation, but you're trying to bring them together using an accounting framework. But also it's been designed to enable you to link the environmental data to economic data. So this, it's not to say that we've answered all of those types of issues which Giles and Robert raised, but hopefully it moves us up the ladder a little bit in terms of trying to create some way of bringing together different data sets, which leads to the second way in which I think CEA can help in the mainstreaming and scaling up, which is around institutions. So one of the large challenges that I've noticed, I've come from a background in economic statistics, measuring GDP, is the lack of coordination in environmental data. It's really done by a whole heap of different technical agencies. And one of the hopes that we have for the CEA is it's able to bring together all of these different technical specialists, whether they're geographers, ecologists, hydrologists, economists, statisticians, to try and find this neutral playground where you can bring the language and ideas together. And there are some real examples where that happens in Australia. It's very clear that the range of technical agencies, one that Alessandra will perhaps allude to in a little bit, is the combination between Eurostat in the European Union, the European Environment Agency, and the Joint Research Centre where Alessandra works. So this sort of combination is something which CEA helps to be a catalyst for. I'm not saying it's the answer to that, but it helps to drive that integration. The third area is, I think, really understanding the role of accounting. And I think it would be unfortunate if we were to see accounting and data as being the same thing. They're not competitors, but they really are things where accounting plays a role of integrating data and trying to create a narrative about the links between, in this case, natural capital and people. And how can you tell that narrative? And that allows us to then link in to a whole range of decision making and the types of issues which Robert and Giles alluded to. So it's sort of this idea of accounting playing a role from turning data and the supply of data into a set of information that can tell you a coherent narrative. and I think the type of example where that starts to emerge more, I mean, the most high-profile example I can see of that more recently is the Dasgupta review, which has received a tremendous amount of publicity, not because it's necessarily new economics. The economics of wealth accounting has been around for 20 or 30 years at least, not because there are new valuation techniques in there, but really about this idea that you can tell this story about the information base being able to be something that flows onto economic and environmental type of policy. So the role of accounting in being able to play that linking role, I think is one that we really need to understand, and I think is really important, and hopefully the CEA plays some role in trying to take us down that path. So I'll finish my comments there. Hopefully that stimulates some questions, and look forward to the discussion later on. Thanks, Ian.
Thank you, Carl. Yeah, really great to hear those thoughts on the things the CEA can help push forward as a framework. Next, we'll talk about the framework being developed for organizational natural capital accounting. I'll hand over to Ece.
Thank you, Ian. Thank you, everyone. I'd like to echo Giles's thanks to everyone and his historical observations of how things have moved on in the last few years. And even this panel a few years ago wouldn't come together. We are showing here a nice mix of academic and practitioners, natural environment, people who work in national scale, and organizational scale, and environmental policy areas and business. We are bringing together, not just in this conference, but generally different actors are coming together to move on from data to analysis to insight together, as Carl mentioned. And that's partly what's been happening at BSI, and has been part of BSI's objective in preparing a standard for natural capital accounting for organizations. BSI is the British Standards Institution, the UK's national standards body, and it's a member of the International Standards Organization. This is interesting that they are in this place because they recognize the need to measure and value, and that doesn't mean monetary value, or it doesn't mean a particular methodology, but they recognize the need to measure and value the benefits from nature and integrating them into economic decision making. BSI is also particularly interesting because the most well-known and used standard in the world is ISO 14000, which is on environmental management, and that has its origins in a BSI standard. This is BSI 8632 that I'm going to talk to you about. BSI sees this organizational account as part of the overall UK and international direction on integrating natural capital into decision making, and it's inspired by all the national accounting work that has gone on before it, and colleagues mentioned and will discuss. It's written by a panel of experts that I convene, and everyone works on it voluntarily, and the panel reflects this panel in some ways, and in that it has economists, environmental scientists, and financial management accountants on it, from academia, business, and private sector. The work started in 2009 with a proposal to the BSI board, and we just been through a 2-month public consultation in November to January, and we are in the process of finalizing with the publication in May this year. BSI, when they approved the process for the standard, was responding to the call from organizations. By organizations, we mean every organization, whether they're private, public, if they're private, listed or unlisted, they might be asset owners, I mean natural capital asset owners, or they might be financial investment asset owners in real economy or in finance, all sizes and in all sectors. They could also work together to create collaborative accounts, for example, at the catchment or regional level. While it's a UK standard, it's intended to be used internationally. there are many frameworks. Alessandra Alfieri mentioned this, a snippet of them, and there are many frameworks, many approaches and tools, and BSI is trying to be a sort of conduit to bringing them all together rather than adding to the bag, being a roadmap, and really focusing on the structure of how natural capital accounts should look like. It's a systematic way of bringing all sorts of different data together using different types of methods and tools, and responding to different types of decision-making requests. The key request from the organizations was that there are too many ways of doing these things. We cannot guarantee comparability of what we are doing with other organizations' accounts, and even what we're doing over time. And when we spoke about comparability years ago, what most people wanted from comparability was that a list of values that they can use. Why can't you have a value per tree I can use in all my decision making? Now the conversation about comparability is much more sophisticated. We're talking about this location, space, species, asset specificity, perhaps because we have more data, we have more better technology to use that kind of data, but it's all the distributional concerns are coming in, as Giles mentioned as well. So the standard is not a kind of definitely use this method, this tool, this data all the time, but it certainly does not have a table of values for natural capital assets, but it puts together, as I said, sort of templates for presenting the appropriate data. The natural capital accounts for organizations are mimicking financial accounts because the main objective is to make nature more visible in financial decisions, essentially economic decisions. So the terms we use is natural capital balance sheet and a natural capital income statement. There had been lots of examples of income statements. They were used to be called environmental profit and loss accounts. The change in that terminology is not because of BSI panel, but the financial accounting terminology has shifted to income statement over the last few years. So we're catching up with them. And they're not exactly the same definitions, of course. The assets that we're trying to include in natural capital accounting are different, and the concerns are different. I won't go into the details, but essentially what we're trying to do is take stock of the assets and their quality and quantity, or extent and condition, you might say, flows of ecosystem services that are provided by those assets, and the benefits to the organization and to the rest of the society. That's the aim of our balance sheet. And for income statement, the focus is on the positive or negative impact of the operation of the organization or its value chain. We made it very clear, and I think this is extremely important to emphasize, that when we talk about value, we don't necessarily talk about monetary valuation. Money as a unit of account is extremely useful. I've spent a career working with that kind of data, but it is also very important to show to your audiences, to your decision makers, that monetary valuation is the last step in understanding what you're valuing and measuring what you're valuing in the metrics that are relevant to what you're valuing. And it's very important to engage all decision makers in this process. This should not be a black box, put a few numbers in, get a few results out kind of accounting exercise, but should be able to bring all the people, decision makers and data providers within an organization together. So the standard also emphasizes the importance of that process. We really need to struck a very delicate balance, and that's the balance of encouraging uptake of natural capital accounting, but also ensuring comparability, transparency across organizations. So if you raise the bar for comprehensive accounting too high, then no one will try it, or not enough people will try it, or it'll become a tick box exercise and not actually be integrated into decision making. If we lower it too low, then we will miss the comparability goal, and could lead to misrepresentation or misinterpretation of what data we have. So we introduce scopes, a little like the greenhouse gas protocol scopes, but different labels in different areas. So scope 1 is what the organizations have ownership, control, responsibility, or influence over. So tidy your own house first kind of approach, and scope 2 is everything else. Everything else, including the value chain, as Robert pointed out, is quite a difficult thing to do. And our main control of quality and comparability is the transparency principle. Transparency in documentation of what you've done. The practitioners of valuation, economic appraisal, accounting, we all know that it's not possible to have a complete coverage of everything you want to include in an account or an analysis. But the key is to be transparent about what's in, what's out, and what are the implications of what you manage to quantify and value. And that's a very important principle of the standard. And I'll leave you with this thought. We spend a lot of effort on improving our assessments of the benefits that we provide from nature, whether it's scientific research or economic research and valuation. But actually, how much we spend on nature to look after it is just as big a challenge. We assume that we know costs very well, and I think national accounts is a great help here, because we do collect expenditure data. We have public spending data, not always as easy to access as you might think, but I think going forward we do need to pay a bit more attention to how much we are already spending, where the spending gaps are, and how can we really channel more of the investment to where it's needed the most. And that's a challenge I leave the panel with. Thank you.
Thank you, Ece, and thanks for giving the other panelists some warning of issues to discuss. It's great to hear the frameworks for organizations being developed, and to hopefully catch up with the publication of the SEER. Our final two speakers will talk about the application of the SEER framework. So firstly, Alessandra Notte, who works on its application at a European scale. Alessandra.
Thank you, Ian. This is actually the second time I participate in this conference. The first time was in 2017, when, being GRC part of INCA, I just started working on ecosystem service accounts. For those who do not know, INCA is a European Commission initiative whose purpose is to implement natural capital accounts in Europe following CIA guidelines and recommendations. INCA is basically, as Carl actually mentioned, a partnership between different institutions like Eurostat, the G Environment, G Research and Development, the European Environment Agency, and the JRC. Within the JRC, I'm part of the team led by Joachim Maas, and I'm working specifically on ecosystem service accounts. Well, now after 4 years, INCA delivered few outcomes: the extend accounts by the European Environment Agency, the condition accounts by the JRC, ecosystem service supply and use table by GRC for 10 ecosystem services, of which 6 have already been published and the others are going to be published in May this year. Now, as a brief summary, I would like to share with you a few key messages we learned by doing while undertaking ecosystem service accounting, and I will now try to share one slide. Okay, this is probably pushed too much because it already went into the animation, but doesn't matter. First of all, when assessing, or we can just, okay, maybe let's. Well, when assessing the flow to be reported in supply and use table, we found out that it is important to identify on one hand what ecosystem can provide, and on the other hand, what is the socioeconomic demand. The information to be reported as ecosystem service actual flow in supply and use table is the match between the ecosystem potential and the ecosystem demand, compliant with CIEA. However, being the results of these two sides interaction, let me just, okay. We need to consider that an increase in ecosystem service actual flow over time does not always mean enhancement in ecological terms. This happened, for example, when ecosystem service potential remains the same and only the demand increases. And there are not only matches, but also mismatches when there is unused potential or when the need for ecosystem service remains unsatisfied. That's what we call the ecosystem service unmet demand. This is all a complementary information, but it can be very useful for a policymaker. And now there is an element, let me just move, okay, all right. There is an element that I would really like to highlight here. The remarkable value added of supply use table is to directly connect ecosystem to economic sector and the society. In our application, by using ecological models and valuation technique, we can assess that, for example, in year 2012, ecosystems were able to provide a yearly flow of about 223 billion euro. Please consider that it only comes from 10 ecosystem services. In the list of sizes, we have about 55 ecosystem services. So we are only focusing on these 10 ecosystem services. Now, the accounting framework forces us to understand which sector used this service. And I personally believe this is really a relevant information, especially when we consider one keyword that is becoming even more and more important, like dependency on nature. So from this data, we can read that about 43% of ecosystem flow is used by the primary sector. Of this, 84% by agriculture only. Agriculture use ecosystem services as input sink protection, and agriculture sector is really key when addressing topics like the resilience of the food system. Then 45% is used by secondary, tertiary, and households. 75% by households only, and that means that really the social dimension matters. And then there is a 12% that is for global society, and this refers to CO2 mitigation and species and habitat maintenance. And it is important to consider the contribution of country to global issues such as climate change or biodiversity loss. Let's imagine how remarkable this kind of flow would be for countries such as, for example, Brazil, that host what are considered global public goods such as the Amazon forest. Then we also try to bridge ecosystem service accounts with already existing economic tools such as multi-regional input-output tables or general equilibrium models. And there was the Lisbeth initiative that was closely linked to INCA. Now, what's next? Eurostat took the lead to publish the INCA final report that will be out within the second quarter of 2021. There will be soon an INCA website where it will be possible to download all INCA outcomes. Moreover, GIS plugin will be available by the end of 2022 on the INCA website to enable practitioners to systematically replicate the ecosystem service model used for INCA. And finally, as already mentioned, the JRC technical reports will be out in May, beginning of May, with the latest ecosystem service accounts that have not already been published. Please don't hesitate to contact me for further information, and thank you very much for your attention.
Fantastic. Thank you, Alessandra. And thank you to Rocky for your patience waiting your turn. You're also going to talk about the experience of applying these methods. And we can link back to what Giles said at the start of the panel about the progress having been made in the UK. Maybe tell us about the view of that from inside Defra. Thanks, Rocky.
Thanks, Ian, and thanks for all the earlier speakers, and good morning, everyone, and good evening to Carl. I think we'll take as read the progress we made on the UK accounts, given Giles's comments. But I'll just quickly review them. We've made what we would say fairly complete accounts. They're disaggregated by 8 broad habitat types. We've covered quite a range of services within them. We've tried to put monetary values on a lot of the service flows. We've got what we call monetary asset accounts, which is quite a key element, fairly unexplored internationally, as part of the Environment White Paper 2011 commitment to put nature into the nation's balance sheet. So we feel we've done pretty well. I've worked on them for 8 years now, and we've made pretty good progress to 2020. And we're now reviewing. And it's very timely to be here and be able to talk about this, because we will be consulting stakeholders in the summer about where we go from here. And there is a tension. We've recognised it in discussion with ONS between increased policy relevance, if you like, extending the accounts to link in with national accounts data, emissions and negative impacts on the environment, against improving what we've got, and just as Carl suggested, just building up a broad database from which we can analyse and understand our impacts. It's not a word I like to use, so we'll come back to that one. Our relationship between the economy, society, and the environment. So the choice really, I think, is what could we work on? Wider range of services. Certainly we'd like to bring flood protection into the accounts, water purification certainly is on our agenda. We need to develop the valuation methodologies further, and this can be on a fairly wide basis. We can pick up welfare values in it's quite a flexible framework we can work in, or we can be completely compliant with the national accounts and look for exchange values. We've got quite a bit of work to do on summarising the condition of different ecosystems. The SEA has given us a good framework to work in, but we've got a massive data, but it's not very well understood and put together. So we've got quite a bit of work to do on that. And I think it's quite key that we focus more on projecting future flows. That's relatively unexplored, as I said, internationally, but it's key to understanding the asset values. And it's also quite a key link with sustainability, because it gives us a better idea of whether we're improving the state of natural capital in a concrete sense. Giles also focused on a range of have they been useful? Have we maximised the uses we've had? I like to think that we've done pretty well, but there's soft gains. I think within the department we talk differently about natural capital over the last few years. So it's been improving our economic, environmental impact assessments, because we're much clearer about what constitutes an ecosystem service. We've also tended to focus on the non-market values, such as air filtration. It's been widely used in speeches and other forms, and I think that's raised awareness of the importance of non-market services. We've done quite a lot of work with people who are on the call here on urban accounts and accounts for urban areas, and that's led directly to a really quite coherent data set, which is informing our approach to green infrastructure, along with a lot of other data, it must be said. I don't think the accounts stand alone in this space. We think we're providing support for subnational applications. I think we can go further on that, but we need to improve the range of detailed, spatially detailed information within the accounts in order to be able to do that. And I should just finish by saying that it's been a joint programme of work with the ONS, but ONS reaches the parts that Defra cannot reach. They kind of authenticate the information we put together, but they also can focus on the big number, but also sort of They do stuff like what's in my backyard kind of audience, the general public who like to know what their authority and what the state of natural capital and the services they get are at a local authority level. And we would never really be able to reach that kind of audience. So I think we've got a good agenda. It will go out to consultation. We'll review what we've learned, but we'll also seek your attention, everybody on the call, your views on what the balance of future work should be between sort of increasing policy interests and applications and developing the accounts and refining them further. Thank you, Ian.
Thank you very much, Rocky, and great to have those reflections and to learn that the development is still planned for through the consultation to continue despite the good progress noted. And thank you to all the panelists for reflecting the progress under your different areas of work, and there's a lot to build on there. One thing that was mentioned by Ece was the use of some language within the different accounting work you all do. And I just thought it would be useful to reflect on that. Actually, I think there's quite a lot of synergy of the language you've all used in your remarks there. Different people, you know, using the accounting framework and talking about linking data between ecosystems and economic outputs. But there's probably some subtleties in the detail of what language we use. Maybe I can come across the panel and firstly ask different people to think about the term impacts being used in different ways. So it's used as regulators typically as a negative thing that they might want to control, but I think in the investment sphere, impact investing is seen as a positive thing. So do we need to harmonize some more of that language? And Ece, is that something that the BSI standard is trying to define use of those terms?
Yes, we struggled in that panel with the language as well, and it's the kind of insidious nature of language, in that it might take you several meetings to realize you've been talking in cross purposes slightly. And one of those is impact, but we're trying to appeal to a broader audience, so we have defined that. And for example, do we talk about ecosystem or asset quality and quantity, or extent and condition? So some of the audiences are very familiar with extent and condition. Others think this is entirely only applied to designated conservation areas, and yet others have never heard that those terms. So we stuck with quality and quantity. That's an example I can share.
Great, thank you. And Carl, it'd be useful to understand maybe that if that terminology is used within SEER or what's used as an alternative.
Yeah, thanks, Ian. It is interesting. I think one of the things that's emerged for me over the course of the last 10 years is that when you're coming from a statistical perspective, as the SEER does, it's very much a descriptive tool. So it's not necessarily focusing on what might be regarded as analysis of how a change in a system or a context has impacted one group or another. So you would use accounting-based information to assess that impact, but that would be a secondary step. So I guess that's the way a statistician would frame it. I think there is another sort of interesting question that has sort of emerged in the natural capital space about impacts and dependencies. And I've been battling with that in my head for well, at least the last 6 or 7 years, to try and rationalise the sort of public sector perspective from that has come through from the SEER with the sort of more corporate perspective on measuring impacts of businesses. I think actually the conclusion I've just reached in the last few days is, in actual fact, a measure of impact is in effect a measure of how you have an effect on someone else's dependency. So it's in a sense a sort of a scaling type of question, as in you don't have an impact unless someone else is affected. and that means that someone else's dependency on natural capital is sort of, or on other things, is being changing. So I think there's a lot of nuance there that doesn't answer the question, the issue that Ece raised, or that you raised, Ian, about impact investing versus sort of negative impacts. But yeah, some thoughts anyway.
Yeah, it's useful to understand how the term might be used and what it links to in the wider framework of information. Yeah, you mentioned obviously use of the term in the investment sphere, so maybe a different perspective on the term from Robert.
Yeah, I'm not gonna do the 5 hour long discussion and explanation of the various ways in which impact is used in the investment industry. It's the most succinct way of describing it, I think, for the purposes of today, is that yes, it's generally seen as, well, it's not necessarily positive and negative impacts, but it's used as a shorthand to attempt to describe something that is additional, i.e. that was actually, that it's not just correlative, but you can have a causative relationship with something, with a particular investment that you made, i.e. if you had not made investment X, would Y actually have happened? And then you get into kind of dead weighting and those kind of processes that are kind of BAU for people like Rocky and other kind of government CBA analysts. I think the thing that I'm more interested in, I think often it's a bit of, I don't want to say it's a red herring, but I think it's in the investment industry, it's frequently used as a commercial language. In fact, the more precise thing that I think would be actually more sort of decision useful, apart from actually it's more meaningful as well, is this idea, as others have said, of dependencies, which is, I am less interested as an investor in the first instance in understanding the additional impact that any investment might have made than I am in understanding the existing dependencies that exist between activity that's already happening and the extent to which credit for that activity it should actually go to a source in the natural environment, or that value chain that I described where it goes from primary productivity all the way to activity X. That dependency chain, I think, is the more profoundly important quantification that we would need in the first instance, because it begins to transform how we understand what economic activity actually is, what it relies upon, and that's where you come to a more tangible, material sense of value. Only after that fact, I think, would be interested then is that's distinct from investing to try and create additional impact. But I think things like biodiversity, that you have this strange space where if you're trying to invest to have a positive impact upon biodiversity, that positive impact potentially, I'm not a biochemistry, I'm not an expert in any means this, but it seems to me that one potentially the maximum positive impact you could have would be simply the maintenance of naturally existing biodiversity. Biodiversity is a term, again, it's tossed around a lot in investment circles, but really what you're talking about, I think, is kind of systemic nodal heterogeneity. So, and it sounds like a cliche, but it's hard to improve upon nature. So I think often you're in this strange space where you can have massive additional positive impact by, what you can claim to, by avoiding degradation of biodiversity, for instance. Then you're into that strange space that also applies in the carbon world of kind of avoided loss, avoided emissions, and the extent to which you should receive credit for that. So there's no definitive answer. Exactly what impact means will be wrestled with by investors for decades to come. But I think in the first instance, actually, it's that dependency relationship which you need in order to understand, if you're ever going to, where positive additional impact might actually sit. And that's because maintenance in the natural world actually is positive, if that makes sense in any way. Yeah. I've blended lots of domains there, so apologies for everyone listening who's an expert, for me totally bowdlerizing them.
Well, thank you, Robert. Yeah, it's interesting to note the difference between using these terms in communication purposes and some of their technical use. Thank you for that. We will continue the discussion, but I did promise everyone a break, so we'll just take that now, and we'll come back and pick up more of the questions being submitted by all the delegates. And just to prove that we're listening to you, I'm going to answer one of the easy questions and then keep all the hard ones for the panel. There's a question about what traditional accountants can offer to NCA, and I absolutely think there's a role for the kind of skills of consistent measurement that come in accountancy. If you can combine that with environmental science skills of understanding what we measure, then that's one of the improvements in information you can get through natural capital accounting. So I'd say to traditional accountants, embrace multidisciplinary work with other environmental disciplines, and you'll definitely add value to the information being generated. Like I said, I'll keep some of the trickier questions for the panel. We'll come back and prepare for those in 5 minutes, and I'll give everyone else 10 to get themselves a refreshment and take a comfort break. So we'll start again at 11:10. So look forward to speaking to you all then. Thank you. Hello, everyone, and welcome back. I hope you've all managed to get a refreshment and a quick stretch from your Zoom location. Okay, we're going to carry on to try and address some of the fantastic questions coming in to our panel. I'm going to start with a question which has had a lot of likes. You can vote for questions with the thumbs up symbol on the Slido chat. So to ask about, well, not just that we're looking obviously for valuations of how much and how the value of the environment changes, but the distribution of that, where, how, and why. And the SEER measures that, I think, in several ways. So I'll ask Carl to reflect on that a bit more first.
Great. Thanks, Ian. Yeah, so the question of degradation is really one that sort of pervades ecosystem accounting. And I guess it's important here to recognise that ecosystem accounting has a range of components to it, which Alessandra Alfieri would have explained before, around extent, condition, and ecosystem services, and then valuation. So one area where ecosystem accounting really starts from a biophysical perspective, so around extent and condition. So with measures of those two, you should be able to get some track on degradation, the extent to which forests might have gone down or up in size. But then you might want to look at their condition as well and get an ecological sense of how that's changed over time. But from a more sort of valuation perspective, the notion of degradation turns into what's akin to a measure of depreciation of produced assets. So then you're looking at the service flows. To what extent have service flows been affected by the change in biophysical condition and extent? And Rocky alluded to that before in terms of future flows and how that's being affected. So there's a concept of ecosystem capacity, which we try and think of, and that links directly to the notion of degradation. I think another one that's important as well is the link to expenditure. So one way which the question of degradation has been as an approach which exists of measuring degradation by the cost that would be incurred to restore the ecosystem to a particular condition that you could measure on an ongoing basis. I think perhaps one of the key things about it is that in order to measure degradation, you're really talking about time series and change over time. So at the heart of an accounting process is that recording consistently over time, whether it's every year or every 5 years, but you need to have that comparison point. So reference values, baselines, and those things become really important in understanding degradation and understanding how far you've come and how things have changed. A final point from an accounting point of view, there's two important distinctions. One is about the standard accounting approach is to allocate degradation to what would be called a cost borne. So it's the asset holder who suffers the cost because their ecosystem services are reduced in the future. Whereas a more common way of framing it is in terms of polluter pays or cost caused. And so the way in which you might look at those two different approaches or frame the question of degradation can be different depending on what question you're trying to answer. Thanks, Ian.
Yeah, thanks, Carl. That's really interesting and actually reflects the use in the discussion before the break of the term dependencies, which I don't think would have featured in a panel discussion at envecon 10 years ago so heavily. So it's great to see our thought structures developing. Yeah, some of the distribution of the changes in the environment obviously is about spatial analysis. So I'll come to Alessandra to maybe talk about how that's done a bit in the European systems, because I know there's a lot of mapping work within that framework.
Yes, indeed, because actually I didn't mention, but INCA was, the basis for INCA was a previous initiative called MAES, that is Mapping and Assessment of Ecosystem Services. So basically all the, any ecosystem services has is biophysical mapping first, and this is the first step. Of course, depending on the service and on the biophysical modeling technique, there may be some initial different minimum reference unit, but at the end, everything is standardized into a grid, into a raster grid. So it is possible to know exactly for each ecosystem service what to which cell of the grid the value refers to. So this is assessed in biophysical terms and then translated into monetary terms. So actually having this spatial information available, it is possible to also, with an additional layer of ownership, to know to whom this land belongs to. And this land is able to provide different ecosystem services. So it is actually possible to have this spatial mapping of the service potential, of the service demand, and of course of the service actual flow. In fact, the modeling technique in Inca will be developed as a tool, as a GIS plugin. So actually it will be possible having input data to use the modeling technique and to map the service. And I think this reference to the spatial location of where the values of each service are is really supporting the principle of knowing ownership and distributional issues.
That's great. Thank you, Alessandra. And I'll come to Giles. You mentioned distributional sort of challenges in your opening remarks. So the frameworks that Carl and Alessandra just described, do they provide frameworks to address those challenges?
It very much sounds like it, yeah. So it's fantastic to hear that, because yeah, you've got that degree of detail that you might need. I mean, I suppose that information is useful in a number of respects, because typically we might think of it in natural capital accounting as being, well, this is an administrative issue. When you move on to a regulatory or a payment scheme to try to incentivize better natural capital management, then you need to know who owns land in order to administer that policy. But I think as well, it's also a wealth distribution question as well, depending on the direction that policy takes. And I think that just doesn't mean the administrative interest is less relevant. It just means there's this additional interest in it as well, which I think takes us down really interesting paths into research questions about how wealth is distributed. And you could think of that as being wealth in terms of the users. Part of my consumption is ecosystem services, so in a sense that's part of the personal wealth that I have, but also who is managing who owns the land on which natural capital needs to be managed. I think is a fascinating question too.
Great, thank you very much. Yeah, so we're starting to talk about the sort of detail of breakdown of information. And then, yeah, there was a question about the granularity of data that's expected to be shared under the BSI standard. So I'll maybe ask Ece to respond to that.
Yeah, thank you very much. So that gives me the opportunity to say what's the standard is a standard or institution defines it is. It's not a guidance document, so standards don't tell you what to do in different contexts. We are the same at this BSI standard. We're not saying depending on sector, location, or natural capital asset, you must achieve a particular level of granularity. The standards are what good looks like, and an opportunity to show that you have done the best analysis that you can do within the scope and with the information available. And it goes back to the transparency. So whatever data that you have access to, make it very clear what you used and what assumptions you had to make to fill the gaps, and where the gaps remain, and what implications that might have to the decisions that you advise. It's also important to mention, I think, that this standard is not a reporting standard. By reporting, I mean going external with it. So the standard doesn't require organizations to publish the accounts that they prepare. Of course, it would be good. The more examples that we can share and we can see, we will all learn from them. But we thought that the reporting adds extra pressure on organizations, and it might actually be a disincentive for doing natural capital accounting. And this is because the objective of engaging with this process, going through thinking about impacts and dependencies on nature, to us is more important at this point in time than publishing your accounts. Perhaps one final thing to say is that it's talking about looking what Carl was saying over time, doing these over time, repeating, and that's important for organizations too. And if we can sort of talk the language of financial accounts, this is not a bookkeeping exercise, or not just a bookkeeping exercise. It's, think of it as management accounts. So repeat it when you need to repeat it, but also use the accounting framework for scenario analysis. What will happen to my balance sheet or my income statement if I invest in this way, or if I change the management of my assets in a different way? So you could do it to set baselines and then take action, make investment. You can use the accounting framework for monitoring and evaluation. So bookending your decisions, if you like, once at the beginning, once in the middle, once at the end, perhaps. These are just practical thoughts, but the standard encourages repeating the accounts and just integrating it into decision making. So I hope that answers.
Indeed, thank you, Ece. It generates lots of rich information. You mentioned in your opening remarks the need to focus on costs and funding, as well as value of changes in the environment. So we maybe can reflect more on that funding gap, both from a public policy point of view, but also the private investor point of view. So I'll ask just Robert to talk about that investor point of view first.
Okay, I thought you were going to cue up Rocky first, Ian. So it made poor Rocky not able to speak after I've given the floor. I'll be diplomatic in my private investor view. So this is probably nothing that Rocky knows. It might be helpful to just briefly describe the sort of options that we would have for investing in broadly natural capital, biodiversity, ecosystem services. So our starting position is we want to do that at massive scale. So we have this big wave of private institutional capital that genuinely now is actively seeking to deliver ecosystem services, natural capital, biodiversity, and invest directly in it or indirectly in it. And we feel that we have to kind of slowly, through the sort of accounting standards that we're talking about today, the beginnings of a process to begin to tangibly understand exactly what it is that we would be investing in and what our investment would do. I think this actually weaves together nicely, actually, what Giles was talking to before, actually. So the first big issue actually is knowledge about who owns land. So if we were going to invest directly in the creation and maintenance of ecosystem services, biodiversity, etc., the cleanest and easiest way to do that commercially is to be the landowner, and then you can fund the works on your own land as an investment directly into that appreciating asset. Now, it's actually very, very difficult, I'm sure everyone knows, to find out who owns land in the UK. I believe you have to sign the National Secrets Act to have access to that database. So that's always a solution, is to simply knock on the door of the landowner and say, hello, could we buy your land? So I think where that ever becomes an option, again, I don't think it's any news to Defra, but the gap then that you're really trying to price is the difference between the maximum value you can get for exchanging all of the goods and services you're able to deliver from a nature-based point of view and the price of the land. Probably is either sort of high agricultural land, but there is a kind of tiered approach there. So maybe if you're optimizing it, you buy the cheapest bit of land you could and then try to maximize this kind of trade-offs about what you can actually do on it. So where that is an option, where you simply don't know who owns the land, and where you want to avoid a sort of bizarre kind of service arrangement where you're trying to, again, ultimately find who owns the land in order to try and enter into a contract to benefit that you get exclusive benefit from works you do on their land. So all of that messy part aside, we would need to find a way to indirectly realize the value of nature-based solutions, ecosystem services, etc., in some other tertiary contract now, or in the valuation of an asset which is indirectly exposed to this. So the most simple way of explaining this would be you have a body of work that's going on in location X. They have a direct or indirect impact on the valuation of asset Y, and then there tends to be a gap still where you would then say, okay, what's the valuation uplift or the risk reduction related to asset Y? Okay, that's slightly slightly less or slightly more than the total value delivered by the ecosystem services. There are different ways to try and close that gap. One would be lots of help from government and some kind of contractual mechanism that exists there, or support system, or fiscal framework, or environmental land management scheme, who knows. But if that wasn't the case, then other ways that I think private investors are looking into do this is to try and this is not in a disingenuous way at all. It's actually, it comes from a place of trying to make these things work, but to try and generate premium value, trying to generate a premium associated with particular bodies of work. So that could be done on a regional basis. So bringing back in this element of geospatial analysis. An example being, you might have a group in Scotland, you might have a group in the Highlands somewhere, you might have versus a group in Wales somewhere operating, or in Devon next, and they'd all be doing similar works, but the regional specificity of the outcomes generated by that would generate a bespoke valuation for those works, and that might close that feasibility gap, i.e. the delta between the price of the land and the nature of the works done. So these are the kind of arithmetic fiendish puzzles which we're trying to work through. I think those are in a very small number of investors at the moment, but it is certainly true that if Defra, Nature England, Forestry Commission, etc., can find ways to close that gap, even marginally, a wave of capital is waiting to make the UK a leader in this, and the EU. To Alessandra, it's not a UK only venture. Over to you, Rocky. Sorry.
Thanks, Robert. I mean, Defra is in this space, obviously, and doing lots of work with environmental land management and other things. So, but to take an accounting point of view on it is quite challenging. We did some work, largely ONS did some work on peatlands, where we did look at the maintenance costs and the gap between the current costs and what is needed to maintain the peatlands in good condition, or actually to restore them to good condition. What we found quite difficult was to extend it to a lot of other ecosystem types and do it across the country, and to project those costs as well. It almost sort of became outside the accounting framework. So although we think it's desirable, I think there's a lot of data, as Ece said, out there, but it's not quite in the format you want, and it certainly doesn't include the future predictions of what you need. So we can put it on the agenda for our review and consultation and see what people think. But in practice, I'm a little doubtful that it should be sort of top of the order. It's certainly interesting, but I don't think we're in that space yet. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Rocky. Thanks for everyone's questions, and I hope we've been able to answer some of them. Thanks to all the panel for your remarks and for engaging in that discussion. We're just coming to the end of our time, so I'm going to finish on time for everyone. But just a couple of reflections on what we've had in the discussion. I think we're talking about some of the moves can be made to harmonize the detail of these frameworks, which we really get into in attempts to apply them, and how their strength lies in linking together information right through the process. It's really interesting to hear an investor like Robert talk about the link right from primary production through to socioeconomic benefits, and equally that's what the framework of the SEER aims to do. So we shouldn't lose sight of that synergy between these natural capital accounting processes when we start to try and harmonize and run into difficulties in specific details. One of those details is obviously the valuation approach is used, which there was a question about we haven't had time to get into, but I'll maybe leave that with you as a thought for the rest of the day through envecon as you discuss a lot of valuation evidence. Many of the presentations cover that. A different way to think about them is, how useful is this information for different types of decision making? Where would it fit into accounting frameworks? Is it measuring welfare or exchange values, or maybe both? Or it could be used better to measure both, could be used better within accounting frameworks. So think about the way evidence can be used in accounting as you listen to the presentations and engage in discussions through the rest of the day. So thanks everyone for joining. Thanks to our panel. You've got a break now until midday, I believe, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the event. Thank you.